Hey there, students. I'm XS. That's little x, little s, which stands for extra sweet, because that's what I am. Time for another lesson. I really look forward to these lessons coming out on Fridays. I hope you're getting a lot out of them. So, how was your week? Did you do anything fun, or were you just busy with work and school and life stuff? Blah, life stuff. Anyway, today we're going to continue with our lesson on Japanese tense. I think as we continue this lesson today, you're going to see why I made the choice to split this up into two different videos. Some of these concepts are pretty difficult, but they're also extremely important. Understanding how to create some of these conjugations is going to become important again in our future as we continue to raise your Japanese level and add more grammatical patterns. But in terms of building a good foundation, there's a lot that goes into making certain that you've gotten these basic patterns down. If you're feeling overwhelmed, take a breath. Remember that it's important for you to take your time, and it's okay for you to make mistakes. That's why we're learning, and I'm here to help as much as I possibly can. So let's get into it, okay? Ikimashou! Before we get into today's content, I want to briefly review the conjugations of the verb suru that we looked at in my previous video. Suru, I'm sure you remember, is a verb in Japanese that means to do. But it's particularly handy because you can add it to the end of many different nouns in order to form a verb that means doing that noun. Benkyou suru means doing study, to study. Copy suru means doing copy, to copy. Undo suru means doing exercise, to exercise. Very mature. Joking about your mom aside, here are the conjugations of suru that we looked at last time. Plain present tense is suru. Polite present tense is shimasu. Plain past tense is shita. And polite past tense is shimashita. When it comes to Japanese tense, these are the four main conjugations that you surely need to know. With these four conjugations, you can talk to your friends about things that you do or things that you did, and you can talk to people in positions of authority or to strangers about things that you do or things that you did. But as I said last time, suru is an irregular verb. It's arguably the most important verb in the Japanese language, but just knowing how to conjugate suru for tense won't really be enough if you want to talk about doing other things like running, jumping, swimming, kissing, walking, or, lots of other verbs that you might want to learn how to say. As a reminder, all Japanese verbs fall into one of the following classes. Ichidan verbs. These are the easiest type of verb to conjugate. All Ichidan verbs end in iru or eru, but not every verb that ends in iru or eru is an Ichidan verb. Godan verbs. In my opinion, the trickiest verbs to conjugate. They are tricky because you have to make just a few more changes to them when you conjugate them. And we also have the two irregular verbs, suru and kuru. By the way, Ichidan verbs are so called because they only have one style of conjugation. For every Ichidan verb, once you've identified that it's definitely an Ichidan verb, it can only possibly follow one pattern. Find the do part, drop the do part, and then add whatever it is that you want to add. Previously, we talked about adding mas and mashita to form the plain polite and past polite, respectively. But there are also other ways that we're going to conjugate verbs, and for Ichidan verbs, that's always going to mean taking the base part of the verb, that is the part without the do, and then adding whatever it is that you need to add. Therefore, any Ichidan verb has only one base, which is why it's called Ichidan. By the way, don't worry about these new conjugations that I'm showing here. I'm only providing them as examples for the moment to illustrate a point, because I want to compare them to Godan verbs, which are so called because Godan verbs are going to have 5 different bases, as we see here. Is it making sense why we call them Godan verbs? The verb iku is going to conjugate in such a way that it will have a base that uses an a vowel sound, an e vowel sound, an u vowel sound, an e vowel sound, and an o vowel sound. A, I, U, E, O. So Godan verbs will make use of all of our vowel sounds in their base, while any base for an Ichidan verb is always only going to have either an E or an E sound. With that definition out of the way, let's use some Ichidan verbs and some Godan verbs to express tense in Japanese, okay? This is the sentence that I introduced to you in the last video when we were discussing the conjugation of the suru verb. Now, let's bend that sentence just a little bit. Same subject, gakusei, new object, nihon ryori, and that means Japanese food, and new verb, this time an Ichidan verb, taberu, and that gives us this sentence. Gakusei wa nihon ryori o taberu. Could you work out the meaning on your own? It should be pretty easy, right? Based on what we see here, gakusei means student, wa is our topic particle, nihon ryori is Japanese food, o is our object particle, and our verb is taberu, which means to eat. So the meaning has to be gakusei wa nihon ryori o taberu. The student eats Japanese food. This is what I mean when I talk about the Japanese language as kind of functioning a little bit like it's a puzzle sometimes. Or maybe it's better to describe it as plug and play. With Japanese, it's usually really easy to find the slot where you want something to go and just move things in and out. Want to change the subject of the sentence? Easy. Find the thing that's in front of the topic particle and replace it. Want to change the thing that's having something done to it? Easy. Find the thing that's in front of the object particle and replace it. Want to change the verb? Easy. Find the verb at the end and change it. Anyway, let's bring back our taberu sentence. Gakusei wa nihon ryori o taberu. Based on everything we already know about Japanese tense and everything we already know about conjugating Ichidan verbs in Japanese, creating the 4 basic tense conjugations for this sentence should be very simple. This one is in the plain present because we're currently using taberu. So let's change taberu and create the plain past. Gakusei wa nihon ryori o tabeta. Simple. For an Ichidan verb, creating the plain past just means dropping the ru and adding ta. That root form, tabe, is going to be what we use for all of these conjugations. And so with that in mind, let's make the mas form for taberu. That's the present polite form, and it looks like this. Gakusei wa nihon ryori o tabemasu. So we've got that tabe root, and to make the mas form, all we're doing is we're adding mas. It's really that easy. Note, however, because I really want to make sure that this is very well understood, the meaning of this sentence is not the student eats Japanese food politely. That's not what mas form means. It doesn't change the way the action is being done. In fact, at the semantic level, it doesn't change anything about the sentence at all. These two sentences mean the same. Instead of thinking as the mas form as doing something politely, think of it as saying your sentence more politely. So a sentence ending with taberu, that's the plain form, carries the nuance of, yo dog, that student eating some Japanese food. While the same sentence with tabemasu carries the nuance of, heavens to Betsy, that student is most certainly consuming foods that are of the Japanese variety. In Japanese, it's not always about what you're saying. It can be just as important to consider who you're saying it to and how you're saying it. Now, that just leaves one final conjugation to deal with, and it's this one. Gakusei wa nihon ryori o tabemashita. This one is just as easy as the mas form. When forming the polite past form of an Ichidan verb, add mashita, and boom, you're done. So here's our conjugation chart for taberu. We have taberu, tabemasu, tabeta, and tabemashita. And this will carry over to any other Ichidan verb in the same way. So let's take miru, a verb that means to see. We have miru, mimasu, mita, mimashita. Right? It works exactly the same way. Drop ru, and then add what you want to add. Now, Godan verbs will be just a little bit more tricky. Let's take a look. We're going to create a new sentence with the same framework that we've already started with. Same subject, gakusei meaning student. Same object, nihon ryori meaning Japanese food. New verb, kao meaning to buy. 学生は日本料理を買う. The student buys Japanese food. So there's our new sentence. The student is now buying the Japanese food instead of eating it. Or like, presumably they will buy it and then they're going to eat it, but that's not important. They can do whatever they want with the food after they bought it. No kink shaming. Let's start by making the mas form of kao, because I think you'll find that it's easier to do that than to try to make the plain past form. To make the mas form of any Godan verb, change the final vowel sound to an E sound and then add mas. In the case of kao becomes kai, kai gets mas added to it, and then we get kaimas. The final vowel in kao is u. So u is going to become e, and then we're going to end up with kaimas. And that gives us this sentence. 学生は日本料理を買います. Easy. And since we've done that, forming the mashita, or the polite past, is also going to be super simple, because basically kao becomes kai, then we're adding mashita. So we get kaimashita, right? We're doing everything the exact same way, except that we're adding mashita instead of mas. And that gives us this new sentence, 学生は日本料理を買いました. Unfortunately, this is where it gets tricky. So, if the plain present form of buy in Japanese is kao, how are we going to make the plain past tense form? Well, we need to create a verb that ends in ta, just like shita, suru in the past tense, meaning did, or just like tabeta, taberu in the past tense, meaning ate. When we were making the mas form, we talked about changing the final vowel sounds of Godan verbs to E sounds before we added anything to the end. So does that mean that our sentence should be 学生は日本料理を買った? You would think so, wouldn't you? Alas, no. There's a whole wacky historical reason for this, but basically because kao ends in an u sound, when we're creating the plain past form, we're actually going to slide a small tsu into the word in place of that e sound. So the correct sentence should be 学生は日本料理を買った. I know. Japanese doesn't even like following its own rules. But I felt it was important to show you this verb because I really want you to be ready. Godan verbs really like to throw little tricks at you from time to time, so you've got to be prepared for them. This small tsu conjugation will happen with words that end in a base u vowel, a tsu sound, or a ru sound, but only in cases where the verb is not an Ichidan verb. So here's our full conjugation chart for the verb kao. It looks like this. Kao, kaimasu, katta, kaimashita. Are you confused yet? Let's look at a different Godan verb for a moment. 学生は日本料理を飲む. Nomu is a verb meaning to drink, so obviously this sentence means something like the student drinks the Japanese food. Forget the logistics of how that works. What matters is that we're going to conjugate nomu. So in the case of nomu, we get the following conjugation pattern. Nomu becomes nomimasu in the polite present, and that makes sense to us. Nomu becomes nomimashita in the polite past, and that also makes sense. But when we get to the plain past, once again, it's got to be difficult. So you might assume it's nomita, right? Change the vowel sound to an E and add ta. But no, again, Godan verbs in the plain past just have to be all tricky for us. It's actually going to be nonda. So nomu, nomimasu, nonda in the plain past, and nomimashita. Any verb that ends in a mu sound, a nu sound, or a bu sound will take nda as their ending in the plain past, just like nonda. And that's just to accommodate sound change. I know it's tricky, but it's one of those things that you have to remember, just like the way u, tsu, and nu can become that small tsu plus ta form. Well, but surely that's it, right? So all of our Godan verbs from here, that they just behave kindly in the plain past form, right? Now, here's another example. We have the verb to listen, which is kiku. Kiku becomes kikimasu, In the plain past, it's going to become kita. And in the polite past, it's kikimashita. Oh, wait a second. What happened to our K sound? When we have a verb that ends in ku, we're going to drop the ku entirely and add ita. And the same thing happens with verbs that end in gu, as in the case of oyogu. So for oyogu, our chart would look like this. Oyogu, oyogimasu, oyoida, oyogimashita. In this case, that gu ending changes to an ida, just like the ku ending changed to an ita. By the way, are you understanding now why I decided to split this lesson on tense into two parts? Godan verbs. They really are a handful. Here's the basic rule for our plain past form for all Godan verbs. If it ends in u, tsu, or ru, it's going to become small tsu plus ta, as in katta. Remember, that is only the case for ru verbs that are not also Ichidan verbs. If it ends in nu, bu, or mu, it's going to take nda as the ending, like nonda. If it ends in ku or gu, it will become either ita or ida, respectively, just like kita or oyoida. And really, that just leaves verbs that end in su. And those, finally, follow the rules and become ita, the way that we expected from the very beginning. So we have the verb dasu, which means to depart, and that's going to be dasu in the plain present, dashimasu in the polite present, dashita in the plain past, and dashimashita in the polite past. Finally, can we put Godan verb conjugation to rest? Mostly. I just want to touch on the elephant in the room. Godan verbs that end in ru but are not Ichidan verbs. Some Godan verbs will end in ru, but the preceding sound is not I or e. Okay, good. Those can't be Ichidan verbs, and we know this because Ichidan verbs always end in iru or eru. Here's a Godan verb that ends in ru and its conjugation. So this is a verb tsukuru, and that means to make. And we've got tsukuru in the plain present, tsukurimasu in the polite present, tsukutta in the plain past, and tsukurimashita in the polite past. Makes sense. It follows all the rules that we expect, no problem. Even the plain past form, it ends in that small tsu plus ta, and that's just what we thought would happen because it behaves exactly like any other Godan verb that ends in u, tsu, or ru. But what about Godan verbs that do end in iru or eru? Some verbs that look like they really should be Ichidan verbs are just jerks that are masquerading as Ichidan verbs that end in iru or eru, but they really conjugate like Godan verbs. Here's an example. This is the verb iru, which means to need something, right? So iru in the plain present, irimasu in the polite present, itta in the plain past, and irimashita in the polite past. Iru looks like it should be an Ichidan verb, right? Iru ends in an iru sound, and based on our definition of Ichidan verbs that we've already established, verbs that end in an iru or an eru should probably be Ichidan verbs. For any Ichidan verb, to conjugate it, we're simply going to drop the ru, and then we're going to add mas or whatever it is that we need to add. But iru is not an Ichidan verb. It's a Godan verb. And why would that be? It sort of just is. Some iru and eru verbs just behave like Godan verbs. It has to do with the evolution of the verb over time, and in some cases that verbal evolution has been lost to time. So we can't even say for sure why a verb that ends in iru or eru is a Godan verb when we really feel like it should be an Ichidan verb. That's unfortunately one of those things with Japanese that you're just going to have to memorize. Kind of sucks, but that's what it is. That's what we have to do. However, there is one handy trick that works most of the time for determining if a 3-syllable iru or eru verb is a Godan verb. Look at these two verb forms. Kaeru at the top is an Ichidan verb. It conjugates like an Ichidan verb. It behaves like an Ichidan verb. But kaeru at the bottom is a Godan verb. It follows all the rules that we expect from a Godan verb. But there's a really subtle difference between these two verbs. It's very small. I'm curious if you can find it. What do you see? Look at the kanji. Do you see how the kanji in kaeru, to make a change, covers only the ka part of the word, while in kaeru, meaning to come home, the kanji covers both the ka and the e? Well, this can be a handy tool for determining if a verb that ends in iru or eru is an ichidan verb or a godan verb. If the e or I is all by itself and it's just hanging out on the outside of the kanji, then it's almost surely an ichidan verb. If the e or I sound is alone, but it's contained within the kanji, then it's a godan verb. This stuff is tricky, and really, I'm sorry, but you almost just have to be ready to memorize it. Okay. Wow. This has been a lot. I would almost suggest that we split this up into 3 lessons, except this is it. The last verb conjugation. Our final verb type, irregular kuru. And actually, it's going to be really easy. We already learned how to handle suru, which is the other Japanese irregular verb. So let's quickly take on kuru and we'll call it a day. Here's our sentence. Gakusei wa Nihon ni kuru. For the last time, gakusei is student, Nihon is Japan. Ni, in this case, is a locative particle. It gives the location where something has happened or something is happening. And in this case, it happened in Japan. And our verb is kuru, which means to arrive. So, gakusei wa Nihon ni kuru. I'm going to breeze through this, okay? Polite present, mas form. Gakusei wa Nihon ni kimasu. Ku becomes ki, and we add mas. Polite past. Gakusei wa Nihon ni kimashita. Same thing, we're just adding mashita. Gakusei wa Nihon ni kita. Kita. Ku becomes ki, and we add ta. Nothing tricky. In fact, this is exactly the way suru behaved when we conjugated it, right? So we had the same chart. Suru, shimasu, shita, shimashita. And then kuru is going to do the exact same thing in this case. Kuru, kimasu, kita, kimashita. We did it. And you thought last lesson was tense. Want to take a quiz? Of course you want to take a quiz. You love quizzes, right? Right? Let's start out today with some verb identification. I want you to just see if you can identify what kind of verb I'm showing you based on your powers of reasoning. I'm not going to include our irregular verbs, suru and kuru, because we already know those two are irregular verbs. So really, the only thing that you need to do for this first part of the quiz is decide if the verb that I'm showing you is an Ichidan verb or a Godan verb. Should be simple. One note before we start. You might not know some of these verbs, and that's okay. Just use the rules that we've already established to determine which type they are. Don't worry about memorizing them yet. I'm not going to test you on their meaning. Or am I? Here's your first verb. This verb is nuru, which means to paint or to cover something with some kind of coating. So is it an Ichidan verb or a Godan verb? Nuru must be a Godan verb. And we know why that is, right? It ends in ru, but it does not end in iru or eru. Therefore, it can only be a Godan verb. And that means that when we conjugate nuru, it's ultimately going to take 5 different vowel sounds in its base as we create different conjugations. For instance, the negative form of nuru becomes nuranai. The u vowel from the base changes to an a sound in order to take the negative nai. Again, don't worry about trying to tackle that conjugation yet, just know that we'll be learning it soon. Next verb, kaeru. We saw this one above, right? Kaeru is a verb that means to return home. Want to hear a funny story about kaeru? I once had a teacher who told this story to me, and I'm passing it on to you. She and her husband were living in Japan, and one day they were late for work. She grabbed her shoes, and they quickly jumped in the car and started speeding towards work. Somewhere on the trip, a frog jumped out of her shoe. Like it must have gotten in her shoe in the night, and she didn't realize it because they were in such a hurry. Now, you may or may not know this, but kaeru is also the word for frog in Japanese. So when she started shouting kaeru in a panic, her husband totally misunderstood and turned the car around thinking that she meant that they needed to quickly return home. Very funny. I laughed a lot. Frogs are cute. Anyway, kaeru. Ichidan verb or Godan verb? Kaeru is a Godan verb. Tricky? It looks like it might be an Ichidan verb because it ends in eru. But remember our little trick. Kaeru in this case is a Godan verb because the kae is contained within the kanji. That means that when we conjugate kaeru, we're going to be looking at changing the vowel sound of ri, as in kaeranai, kaerimasu, kaereru, or kaero. All right, well, how about this one then? Neru is a verb that means to sleep. You can use it both in the case of going to bed and also in the case of actually falling asleep. What do you think? What kind of verb is it? An Ichidan verb or a Godan verb? It's got to be an Ichidan verb. It ends in eru, and we know that in most cases when a verb isn't being a jerk, if it ends in eru or iru, it's going to be an Ichidan verb. The exceptions to the rule, those Godan verbs that look like Ichidan verbs, are mostly going to be verbs that are just iru or just eru, or three-syllable verbs where the e sound or the s sound is a part of the kanji. I know, it's still pretty tricky, isn't it? You'll get there. Your Puppy-Sensei believes in you. Some of these things really do just have to be memorized. Why don't we try one or two conjugation drills, okay? I'm going to give you a couple unfinished conjugation charts. You just have to tell me what's missing. Easy enough. Let's try. Here's the verb asobu. It means to play. It's a Godan verb, and we know that it has to be a Godan verb because it doesn't end in iru or eru. It ends in bu, and we know that verbs that end in bu in the plain past tense are going to end in nda. So I've given you the plain present, asobu, the polite present, asobimasu, the plain past, asonda, and now all you have to do is give me the polite past. What is it? Asobimashita. Right? Pretty simple, isn't it? Why don't we do one more? This time a little bit more tricky, okay? Korosu. This word means to kill or to murder. Hey, Manager-sama, remind me to set aside some, scary words for the words of the day in Dogtober. Anyway, this is a Godan verb, and so to conjugate korosu, we've got koroshimasu in the polite present, we've got koroshimashita in the polite past, and what about the plain past? How do you use the past tense killed in Japanese when you're talking to your friends? Koroshita. Those Godan verbs that end in su are at least a little bit well behaved. Thank goodness. So, tense in Japanese. It's not easy. It's really not. I know it's not. Even I struggle with it sometimes. Even Japanese speakers who have spoken Japanese for their whole lives mess these things up sometimes. It's just like library and library. Over time, with a lot of exposure, you'll start picking up these patterns, and they're going to become second nature to you. But what's the most important thing to remember? Try it. Do it. Practice it. If you fail, that's okay. Get back up. I'm here to help. I want to help. Being able to put these lessons out there, hearing from so many of you that you find the way I teach Japanese to be helpful, that brings me so much joy. All I want to do is be able to help you, to inspire you to learn and to master Japanese, and to see you soar. I've said it before, but I'll repeat it again. Puppy-Sensei loves you. I've been XS. Lead with love. See you later. Mata ne!